Hello, everybody. Here is Michael from New Left, and today I have a new, very interesting guest. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Jakob, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jacob Capella. I'm a professor for socioeconomics at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, and I also had a research institute for economic development at the University of Linz in Austria. My research interests are political economy issues connected to questions and challenges in economic development, how this relates to economic institutions, how this relates to social stratification, and when trying to better understand these things, I typically take a pluralist perspective, which means that I try not to rely on a single theory, but rather try to combine, integrate complementary theoretical arguments that might help illuminate what really happens.
Okay. So in the short term, this will be a discussion about inequality. And my first question is how it came to be that inequality became your primary topic or one of the primary topics that you are focusing on. What were the breaking points or the aha moments in your life that kind of made it happen that Jacob Kappeler is inequality researcher?
I think there are several motivations. One is that when we look at economic development from a historical perspective, we quickly find that inequality is often a decisive variable that coins further developments, and that is also somehow situated in a complex relationship with other variables. So typically, what you have is that you have some kind of growth, say population growth, city growth, stuff like that, that is typically associated as positive. And with this growth, with this expansion, typically also comes an increase in inequality. And then, so to say, this increase in inequality that somehow emerges naturally in a natural process, then undermines the stability of societies, of cities, of communities. And so we have a complex relationship, and the question is how this plays out. Sometimes societies find ways to stabilize themselves in different fashions. Sometimes this leads really to some kind of collapse. So this would say that a rough historical interest that has become more and more validated also in recent decades when we look at more recent research that substantiates this core intuition and also gives us some indications on how to qualify.
One thing I know about inequality, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it wasn't very sexy topic in the past, and who kind of made it happen was Thomas Piketty. That before Piketty, well, there was some interest, but on the edges of the academia, and Piketty made it sexy. And I don't know whether I'm correct, but something broke there for decades. Inequality was just like almost no one was interested in that because, well, I don't know why, but what is your opinion? Why it wasn't a topic? Because inequality was with us from, well, from the beginning, thousands and thousands of years, but somehow academia was neglecting it.
Silent.
Yeah.
That's actually the second reason I wanted to mention what got me into inequality research. So when I began studying economics in the early 2000s, as you say, inequality was a non-issue. And it was a non-issue because in the dominant view of economics as a discipline, in the mainstream economic view, you would say inequality is a solved problem. So we know, at least that's the idea of the theory, it says that we know how distribution is governed, we know the key mechanism is competition, and then we would say more or less roughly competition awards everyone with a share that roughly represents what he or she contributed. So this idea that
as fairy tales go,
the market
did you
competition
believe
will bring
it?
a fair outcome. Of course, there is a fairy tale component here because there are very many assumptions wedded into this analysis. But people believe that, and so you would say, okay, we have explained it. And then the second key argument was that inequality does not do much. So it can be explained it's something that we maybe have to explain, but it's not a causal factor that pushes anything. And also, this was a diagnosis I was skeptical about when I was a
Hmm.
student. So I got into inequality research quite early, and I even started, for example, doing research on wealth inequality before Piketty's book. So
Ah,
before it
okay,
was,
okay, okay. So you
but
kind of got the wave and are surfing the way now, and
yeah, I
okay.
was a little bit ahead of the wave still. So no.
Good
Uh,
for you. Good
just to
for
make
you.
that clear. No, but you're right that with the advent of Piketty's work, of course, the discourse changed, the topic became more visible, and also it was no longer so easy to say that everything is well understood in terms of both causes and consequences of inequality. And I think one important aspect that pops up here is also that Piketty, as well as my early research, is a little bit distinct from most of works in economics that existed back till then, because it focused on wealth. You know, when we think about economic inequality, the first two dimensions we would have in mind is income and wealth. And much of past research really focused on income, focused on labor market issues, often even bracketed out capital income as an important component of income, especially when we are concerned about distributional issues. And what we typically find is that wealth inequality is always higher than income inequality and is also a driver of income inequality. So by shifting the focus a little bit from income to wealth, we also get closer to the roots of the problem or the roots of the underlying dynamics that where basically inequality then feeds back on social and
Mm.
economic development.
That's one of the questions I wanted to ask is the failure of academia to wake up earlier, because the inequality, as far as I know, started to rise rapidly in the 70s, but the academia really wake up to that fact 20, 30 years later. And this disconnect, this open scissors of, well, this is what is really happening, and these are the fairy tales that it's not happening, and this denial of reality that it's not happening brought us partially where we are. Then now everyone is aware that, oh, fascists are ante portas. How can that be? and
Yeah,
and most people play surprise, but it was, it was like, I mean, everyone who read few historical books about what happened back then, 100 years ago, should have sounding the alarm bells much earlier than 10 years ago or wherever the discussion started about rising fascism. And we made it, or we brought it upon ourselves just by neglecting the facts and the past experience. So the question is why? Why did it
um,
happen? You are swimming in those waters with those academia, so why were they so blind? I mean,
uh,
I part of it is some, conscious blindness. It wasn't sexy. You don't go into a topic that isn't sexy because everyone else in academia tells you, "Hey, man, this is a career suicide. Don't do this to yourself." But
I
it's
think it
strange.
was the famous economist Robert Barrow who said that distribution is a poisonous topic. I think this was still in the early 2000s. So it's something
Uh-huh.
you should not be engaged with.
Don't touch it.
But that is probably an extreme point of view. In my view, it's very simple. When I came into economics, there was only in the whole studies, bachelor master's degree, there's only one theoretical approach, what you call mainstream economics or neoclassical economics. And this is one of the key points of the pluralist critique, so to say, within economics, that we would basically say, okay, not every argument and not every assumption you use in mainstream economics is always totally wrong. But if we only have that mindset, if we only have that perspective, we will systematically overlook things, important things. We will maybe plunge, regress into groupthink. So basically making assumptions not because we believe that they are adequate for the problem, but rather making assumptions because everyone else makes it. And then you get in the danger that your discipline becomes lopsided because of this, so to say, tendency to take only one
Mhm.
perspective. So the
Yeah, but
pluralist
why did it
critique,
happen? Why? Why? Who made those choices that this is the only play in town, and everyone else who wants to play a different game is out. And when it happened, that's purely, I'm not in academia, but like an intuition thing. You don't look at the problem only from one perspective. You can, but even Socrates knew that you don't know nothing anyway. So like.
It's difficult to say. If you look at you would typically say that the turning point is located somewhere in the 1970s. And what we see historically is that the academic discourse in economics exhibits successive closures. So say with the end of Second World War, all those who were doing analysis from a more historical perspective were more and more dropping out of the discipline because their research used too little math. Then in the 60s, Marxist arguments became more and more unacceptable, but also more as a social trend than for pure scientific or analytical reasons. And a similar thing happened to Keynesian arguments in the late 1970s. And this was decisive because Keynesian ideas were also quite visible and influential in macroeconomic policy making. And basically, so this latter change also contributed, of course, to an ideological shift towards neoliberalism, because this one perspective that remained is, say, very sympathetic to deregulated markets, to individual responsibility, and really believes that the economy is a self-organizing system that works best when we leave it as uninterrupted as possible. No, and if this view that I would say is often ends up in a fairy tale, but is not basically has many elements that can be legitimate parts of scientific theories if we use them much more critically and context aware. But so to say, what we have is an overstretch of these models and the associated worldview, and this makes you overlook stuff. And there is a broad debate on what are the reasons for this lopsidedness, and typically you would say it's a complex combination of internal factors, so really changes within economics. The stagflation crisis in the 1970s was, for example, broadly recognized as an intellectual defeat for Keynesian theory. And it was one. So there are internal developments in science, and other such developments are, say, related to the development of new methods or so that make basically a specific type of economics more attractive as a career path. And of course, there are also external factors. So an external factor that is repeatedly mentioned in the respective literature is a change in the political demand for economic ideas. So you could say that ideas outside of the mainstream were also discredited more and more in political circles. And you see this, for example, very clearly in European social democracy. If you look at party programs, so party manifestos, you will find that over the course of history, social democrats typically cited the renegades. They cited Marx, they cited Keynes, they cited Galbraith, they cited Myrdal. That's over the course of history. So social democracy, for example, and also unions, got informed by critical economists that took a critical stance. And then in the 1980s, there was a hole, and social democratic parties started copy-pasting mainstream economic textbooks and had then a much less critical stance, say, on free markets, or a much less critical stance
Okay,
on
interesting
deregulation.
question then. Why was there this hole? What happened? I mean, it was just a
Because
bad luck that there was no kind of visionary with some new approach on the left side of spectrum, or?
I think this you cannot explain this with a simple single reason, but rather it's a complex process. You have these internal
No, I'm not
changes.
saying it's just one on it, but I'm
But
curious because this is good point that you made, that there was nothing else. So when there is nothing else, you grasp to what there is, and when it's bullshit, you believe it because there is nothing else anyway.
I think the great twist, so to say, here is that you have, out of internal dynamics that are maybe more a little bit sciencey driven, And science does not always proceed in the right direction and does not create linear progress. And it's typically for the history of science that you have phases of groupthink where you do not question fundamental assumptions. No, that's a core insight of Thomas Kuhn's book on the structure of scientific revolution. So this can happen that you basically have this drive. At the same time, of course, there was always this political interplay. You can say this starts in the 1950s because basically the Cold War discredits up to some extent approaches that are not in favor of the free market. So there's always this political interplay. And if you look in the 1980s, 1990s, you have this coincidence that there is a lacuna of alternative ideas in economics. There is this missing intellectual component. And at the same time, you have the end of the Cold War and, this, say, one decade enthusiasm in the 90s
End
that
of
we have the
history.
end of history
Yeah.
and everything will become, so basically, liberal market democracies.
Butterflies, flowers, paradise. Here it comes.
And again, you have this complex interaction. So you have a lacuna of no critical ideas, rather this simplified story of linear progress in the political sphere. And similarly, this a phase of strong groupthink in the.
So
in
basically
the
a perfect storm of shit. Yeah.
I would say this was very conducive to basically the rise of neoliberalism as basically a very old idea that has already been discredited once in the 20th century that came back because uh, people could not think in terms of an alternative, at least for, say, till the financial crisis. There was much reluctancy, say, amongst European social democrats to really admit that some decisions, say, in the late 90s by the Labour Party or in the early 2000s by the German Social Democrats were really against the spirit of these parties. And I think there is this quote from Rasmussen. He was the head of the European socialists in the European Parliament, who in 2009 said in an internal meeting something like, we could have known this, we could have anticipated this if we just stick to what we wrote into our manifestos 1978. We could have anticipated what happened 2008. But on the way, we lost this critical stance. So I think the third way, what we call the third way, this drive towards market liberalization within social democracy is a perfect example for how complex this interplay is. At the end, it's political economy. So it's about intellectual ideas that can have great political impact and leeway. So it's on the one hand, it's somehow science. You can argue with data, you can argue with theories, you can use tools of logic to check your arguments. But on the other hand, there's always also a political component. If I have the perfect theory that explains how to reduce unemployment, this theory is still not important if reducing unemployment is not your political goal.
Okay, so this was the technical part of the discussion, what happened in the science, and now let's talk about the not so funny part of the discussion, what happened in reality, because science is in this kind of sphere of, well, you are a professor, you write your things and you live your life, but the reality bites you in the ass. So let's describe the reality, what happened and what we are living through. And as a first question, or kind of where I want to lead the debate, I wrote today an article kind of because I knew that we are doing this interview about the inequality, that what we are living through nowadays is the highest inequality, presumably. Now that's the question. You can comment on that in the history of mankind. And when you compare it with ancient Egypt, everyone kind of imagines how unequal that society was, or Middle Ages and kings and whatnot, and you put it into the perspective of today's money, then all those people were basically peasants. The Egyptian pharaohs wouldn't even register on the Forbes 500 list. They would be like losers. And this leads to the question, how can that level of inequality arise in a presumably democratic societies? And how come that, as I said, the alarm bells were not ringing 50 years ago? because it was obvious, like what is going on is just crazy. When you look at it holistically from a historical perspective, what we are living or what we were living through 50 years ago was crazy, and today is batshit crazy. And people are still kind of no, oblivious and don't want to acknowledge what's going on. Many. I'm not saying everyone, but a huge part of population just doesn't see the reality for what it is. I always say to people, it's like Plato's cave. You know, they see the shades, and yeah, shades.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two very different perspectives one can take on that. The one is the one would relate to the question, how does this kind of inequality arise and why does it increase over time, and how is current inequality to be judged in historical comparison? The other one is why it is difficult to get a good impression or mental picture of the degree of inequality. And
Let's unwrap it. Yeah, let's unwrap it.
this
Let's
is
start with the
really
first
a question
question,
that
and then
has
because
to
it's interesting discussion. This is really human nature. Why is there this intentional blindness not to see things for what they are, even though it's not even elephant in the room, it's a Titanic in the room. It's like it's so huge and the numbers are so huge that maybe that's one of the reasons why that people just can't grasp billions and trillions and whatnot. So
yeah,
it becomes so
that's one
ephemeral
aspect.
for
Huh?
them that it doesn't even register. Huh?
I mean, for one, I'm a core analytic, you know. I would say if we take this long-term perspective, the long-term comparison, then we can clearly say with the data we have and with the accumulated knowledge we have, we can quite clearly say that as soon as we live in property-based economies, this is even broader than capitalism. Yeah? In property-based economies, we will typically have increasing inequality over time. So this is the business as usual case in history. You have property, then accumulation will typically run faster than average growth, especially as average growth per capita, because in early time a lot of growth translates into population growth, and then you don't have growth
By
per
the way, this
capita.
is something that Piketty wrote in his book. So
Exactly.
this was something no one knew before that, because for me it was like pretty obvious that
Mm,
yeah, if the growth is
eh,
faster, then yeah.
I would say we knew that, but Piketty found a simple, I tell my students, even a little oversimplified frame with the R over G, the rate of
Uh,
return being greater than the growth rate. That's not really totally
yeah,
precise
it's
because you
yeah,
also have to
but
factor in the so to say, the
lost in
savings
translation. That's
behavior of
okay,
the
but I
elite.
was surprised when I read it that it looked like wow. It's like it's like gravity when Newton found it. Like obviously it was there the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I would say so. I knew that, but Piketty, as often, yeah, people we know something, but we it's not popular knowledge or it's for contextual reasons not deemed interesting. But this general tendency that accumulation runs faster than growth means that we will typically, in stable property-based economies, societies, observe rising concentration over time. And sometimes this stabilizes at a very high level of inequality. And the typical pattern is that the top 1% owns 30 to 50% of all wealth, and the top 10% will own between 65, 70, and 90% of all wealth. And the bottom half of the population typically will not own anything substantial
Mm.
in terms of relative shares. If we transgress the upper limits of these boundaries, or maybe even at some lower values, but if we transgress the 50% for the top 1%, and so societies will typically become unstable and have some kind of collapse, civil war, economic crisis, or maybe the inability to fight off an external enemy. So what we observe is that the pure institution of property gives us this tendency towards rising inequality, and this endangers societies. And what we typically find, and this is how basically societies can keep on a stable level of inequality, although it's typically still extremely high, is that over time societies invent checks and balances, something like debt relief or insolvency law or a welfare state, or maybe something like usury laws or guild system or the provision of commons. And all these institutions would serve, say, as a check and balance factor, as a stabilizing factor. And there can be, say, nicer stabilizing factors like a welfare state, creating more social inclusion that stabilizes a society, or, say, gated communities to protect the rich from the poor with weaponry would be a darker check and balance, but could still stabilize society. No? So this instability does not go unrecognized, and typically endogenously some institutions will develop that serve as a counter factor, as a counter movement.
Now then leads to the second part of the question. So why are people blind to this? I mean, it's mega interesting for me that there is an elephant in the room. It's just huge. Can be people convinced that someone can work 1,000 times harder and is 1,000 times smarter? I mean, just what I say to people, it's like believing in X-Men. You know, we don't live in a world of X-Men, that somehow people believe that, yeah, X-Men are real and some people are just chosen by higher power to be whatever. I mean, how is inequality research looking into this intentional blindness of huge portion of the population that they want to believe fairy tales?
I would say that basically the one thing is that most people typically accept the existence, or maybe not accept, but yeah, maybe not happy with it, but have factored in, have the expectations that some kind of social class exists.
Yeah, but why?
But the idea, but my argument is rather the idea of they are the rich and the poor, or those who have to work. And
it's like it has always been like this. So, well, what can you do about it? Something like that?
No, I don't want to make a nihilistic argument, but if you're not an economist, if you maybe not so interested in so much things, so the first thing you will do is to rationalize it in a 0-1 way. There are the poor and the rich, there are small people, there are large people. No, and this is a very simplified metaphorical representation. And now when we ask people, can you have a more nuanced, a more detailed, can you do a more detailed representation of what you think about, say, large and small people? People will typically come with saying, okay, yeah, my common impressions is that we have maybe some mean, and people will cluster around the mean, and you have this idea of a normal distribution. And then you will say, okay, there are some differences, but when I want to go from the mean height for a male, say 1.85, to the largest male in Austria, say, who is 2.1 meters or so, you have to multiply the mean by 1.2 from the mean to the max. If you want to do the same thing for wealth, you have to multiply by a factor of 100,000. And this is something, this would lead, so we could say that if body size would be distributed like wealth, and you tell me, hey, today I met a really tall guy, this would mean that this tall guy would be 200 kilometers tall. And these kind of proportions are difficult to imagine, and also they do appear very rarely, say, in our natural environment. So we are not used to think in terms of this extreme inequality where 1% of some population has 40 or 50%.
No, that's the question, because aren't we not? Because when for example, the famous Deval video about the monkeys and how they perceive inequality, so looks like all social animals are perceiving inequality and unfairness So it's ingrained in our biology, it seems. So how can it be that people get blind to such extreme inequalities as they exist in
That's
our
what I say.
societies?
We are quite good at observing difference, but most people would rationalize difference categorically, and or in terms of two groups, or maybe in terms of a ladder of groups or something like that. And as it is difficult for many people to really imagine what a billion is, this high degree of concentration and the corresponding enormous degree of inequality is difficult to imagine, and at the same time, it's difficult to accept that that's the usual case in history. So we have the
No,
usual
here
case.
I want to be more precise.
Yeah,
History in the history as is written the last 10,000 years. When you look at the history of mankind as such, so the 250,000 years, then inequality is these high inequalities, relatively new phenomena. So,
sure.
you know,
That's what we said in the beginning. So for hunter-gatherers, we typically have no strong inequality. We have a rather uniform distribution of wealth, basically because these people do not have assets in the modern sense. And if they have no assets, you can have no property-based economic system in this sense, and you will get um,
no, that's up for debate. You can still have a guy there who says this is all mine, and you have to accept it. All the herds, all the whatever is mine, and but
yeah, but
people would laugh that fella off, no, in
yeah,
those society. But we somehow accept this 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 this
yeah,
this assertion that this is mine and you can't touch it.
Typically in hunter-gatherer societies, you can of course have, although it's not so common, but you can of course have strong hierarchies. But these hierarchies are rather social and cultural. They are simply, they do typically not materialize in assets. And you also can recognize this because in studies, you look for transmission mechanisms, and you find that basically material wealth for hunter-gatherers is much less important than, say, social connections or physical features of the body. So, so yes, there are, so to say, communities with strong hierarchies and so, but typically these are not based on, say, inherited assets. And these kind of lootable, storable, hideable, inheritable assets, these are typically, so to say, the foundations of the property-based systems. And as soon as we have these property-based systems, we very quickly observe accumulation running faster than growth, and then we have not, say, a uniform distribution of wealth,
That's my question. That's
but a
my idea
so-called
about history. That
power law
something
distribution.
broke 10,000 years ago, and everything that people were telling themselves for millennia stopped to be believed, and we started to believe something else, and that's how inequality emerged. Because at the end of
Sure.
the day, it exists only because we are willing to accept it. No, if no one would accepting it, then it dismantles in one day. No, there is
That's
a
the
narrative somewhere. It emerged that yeah, this is how it should be because whatever, and people just shrug their head. Well, yeah, this
this
is
is
it.
this is the standard story, no? The Neolithic Revolution, so men moving out of the hunter-gatherer phase and becoming sedentary. Um, this is not only the starting point of, say, cities and writing and language in the modern sense, and so to say, civilization, as we often frame it affirmatively, but it's also the starting point of property, classes, hierarchy, social inequality, also up to some point, the starting point of, say, patriarchy. So other dimensions of distinctions becoming more important. And this is the big ambivalence of the Neolithic Revolution. No, it creates the things that we maybe cherish because they stand for some kind of cultural progress, like, say, science, the, the ability to do statistics on wealth inequality. But on the other hand, it created also the wealth inequality that we then analyze. And so that's the
Mm.
big
Yeah, but
ambivalence, of
it
course.
doesn't have to be this or that. Isn't it like there is a failure in our society to accept this bad part of civilization and justify it because, well, look, but you got this and this and this. and this is a discussion I'm often having with right wingers, that they say that you shouldn't be complaining about capitalism because look what we all got, yeah. But that's my counter argument. Is I'm not saying we shouldn't go to Neolithic revolutions times and just be somewhere in the woods and hug trees. I'm just saying and asking the questions: why are we not accepting reality for what it is, that no one can really work 10 times or 100 times or 50 times or 1 billion times harder? So why we are accepting billion times bigger wealth? It's a cultural thing. This is not something that is written, in our genes or what. This is a fairy tale we made up, and we can change it, in my opinion. No, that's the question I'm asking, whether it's changeable.
I mean, the question you raise is whether this extreme inequality or concentration of wealth is legitimate in some sense, or maybe why we view it as legitimate. I think this is basically maybe the next question. The first question for me would be simply to ask, do we have an alternative? And this brings me again to these checks and balances I mentioned. So unchecked, per default, we have this increasing inequality. And then I said that basically societies are not that stupid. Sometimes they develop a reaction. Yeah? If in ancient Babylon, 80% of the population is in debt peonage, the god king comes and says there's a debt relief. You can say this is not too much, but at least so basically all debts are off at that point and you can have a restart. After the restart, the old accumulation dynamics kick in and lead again to concentration, but for another decade or what, the debt relief stabilizes. And then we can think constructively about the fact, okay, which checks and balances have we developed over the course of history, and which of those have managed maybe even to not only to stabilize but to turn the tide. And if we look into history, we find that there has been one phase where the checks and balances we erected were not only sufficient to stabilize society, but really to turn the tide. And this would be, say, the phase from 1945 to 1975 in the global north countries, where you have this golden age of capitalism, where you basically build up the welfare state, increase social infrastructure, empower unions and workers. And this leads to a conducive feedback loop where, say, a significant portion, still not the bottom half, but a significant portion of the upper half of the wealth distribution who did not have significant wealth before has been put in a position to also accumulate a little bit at least for, say, becoming a homeowner. And this is already a historical
So
novelty.
basically, today's baby boomers are the luckiest guys in the history of
Yeah,
mankind, kinda.
yeah. If you view it from this perspective, they also are the ones who polluted a lot. So they're
Mm.
lucky guys in a double sense, which is no reason to be.
Well, we are the unlucky. They are lucky. They will not be here in 10 years.
Yeah,
So
that's what I
it's our
say. So
shit
they were lucky in a
to
double
deal with
sense,
it.
and it's okay that they were
As
lucky.
as the Wachowski said in Matrix, oblivion is bliss. So ignorance is bliss. They lived their lives, enjoyed it, and next generation's problems.
Yeah.
Après moi le déluge, no?
And this brings me also to this question of legitimacy. I think if you think about legitimacy, it has always been in political debates framed as a question of fairness. It has always also been framed as a question of economic functionality. Will a society really run smooth if so much wealth and power is concentrated at the top? And it has been framed as an issue of social stability. And these three reasons would give you, say, a political justification to question the legitimacy of this extreme inequality. And I think a fourth reason that has popped up in the last 2 decades is also that the very rich have a very large share of global emissions. So I think these are then the four factors: the ecological impact, social stability, economic consequences, and moral considerations on fairness that can lead basically, or that can justify a questioning of these fundamental inequalities. But at the same time, I think it's very important to acknowledge that that is a built-in feature of these property-based economic systems, because if we do not acknowledge that, and maybe this mechanistic part is more important, we do not recognize that we need these checks and balances, these institutions that every day systematically work against the endogenous mechanism leading to greater inequality. And we see that this has changed with neoliberalism. So with neoliberalism, the distributional dynamics in Europe, for example, have changed again. And we observe for now 4 decades rising inequality in terms of wealth. It is not as high as it was, say, before World War I, when there was a long phase of stable feudal or late feudal societies becoming industrialized. But it's still, we will reach that level if we simply go on that path for the next years.
No, that's what happened in Americas. No, they are ahead of us, and I mean, we kind of changed the tides a little bit. Like what happened in Europe 100 years ago with fascism is now, in my mind, is happening in Americas, because the inequality there is much higher, and the reaction, counter reaction is what it is. No, fascism on the rise, and
This is
demagoguery rules. No?
Yeah, one author who has classically captured this idea which I present a little more in general terms with this kind of stabilizing institutions was, of course, Karl Polanyi, who in his book The Great Transformation already argued in the 1940s that basically these tendencies towards more economic pressure due to rising inequality and also due to rising marketization will lead to what he called counter movements. And then there are these counter movements, if you look for examples, would be stuff like the New Deal or the introduction of the welfare state in Europe. So you could call them, so basically, inclusive counter movements. But but according to Polanyi, the essential thing about the counter movement is that it emphasizes the notion of collectivity. So you could also view the Russian Revolution or the rise of fascism in Germany as a counter movement against this, so to say, individualistic, competitive, economic pressure-based way of living. And you see, we have these endogenous reactions in this frame, this counter movement, these checks and balances, these stabilizing institutions. And I think understanding that we inherently need such institutions to make our societies, especially democracies, stable, and also to recognize that simply there are great qualitative differences across these institutions when we compare across history what has emerged to stabilize societies against this backdrop of rising inequality. We have a great variety of things and of outcomes, and some are really not attractive, whereas others can feature maybe as role models for future policies for how to confront also
what I
maybe
learned just
future
recently, and I wanted to bring this to your, I mean, I'm curious to your answer, is that what is happening in schools, from the data I've seen, is that the schools are not really there to kind of learn or bring people new knowledge. But what they really do is they kill curiosity. When you look at small children, let's say 4 or 5 years old, they all constantly ask why. All the children, or I mean, from the data I've seen, like 90% of the children are small scientists. And then go into school or kindergarten and school, and when they leave the school where they are 20 something, then depend on the countries. In Scandinavia, the best country is Finland. Roughly 40% of those graduates are still curious. But in my country, in Slovakia or in Germany or whatever, it falls to less than 20, 15, 18 and whatnot. So basically the school kills, depends on the country, 60 to 50% of curiosity in humans. Please comment, because that's my opinion, that if everyone or almost everyone were as curious as the children are the biggest communists. No, why is this lady lying on the ground, and why isn't she, and whatnot, and why is she betting and whatnot? So why, yeah, is the very seldomly asked question in our society by adults. The children, they ask it all the time. That's why many adults are so uncomfortable around children, because then they have to think about the answers, and well, often they don't have one.
I mean, it's
That's
maybe
my
not.
explanation why it can be that people accept this extreme inequality, that really a big chunk of population gets brainwashed into not even question it, not even ask why. You can't ask why, because why is dangerous. When you ask why in the school too often, then you will not be the favorite pupil of the teacher.
I'm 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 no expert on that for once.
Nah, I just wanted to run it by you because that's something I learned recently. I've seen the data and I was like, okay, this looks interesting. That school here isn't really. And we have actually a fella in Austria who said it beautifully. Illich, he was a expert on school. That school is a PR agency that teaches you that the world should stay as it is. I'm paraphrasing now. So amen to that. Not question status quo.
I mean, I'm no
Not
expert on
everyone is
that,
like that. Roughly
but
20%
but
of the population ask the question, but majority of population just stops and they accept reality for what it is. This is how it's always been, or whatever they tell them themselves, and they just go
from
through
from
life like this.
from a methodological point of view, I would guess that even if we did not have any school at all, um, that so to say 6-year-olds would be more curious than 20-year-olds as a default. And then, as you say, it's difficult to make a general claim because, it much depends on school organization and school design. It can be,
No,
say,
that's what there are differences between countries. It's
yeah,
not
yeah,
everywhere is
and
the
I would
same. It's
also,
interesting to see that the Scandinavian countries they killed inequality, curiosity as well, but not in such a manner as other
and
countries.
then you and what I would factor in here is that what we know from research also on social stability is that shared collective institutions help to stabilize society, not only, so to say, by making inequality more acceptable, but also by, say, creating some positive association to democratic values, to ideas of individual dignity, by creating, say, trust in other public institutions that are maybe, so to say, not directly responsible for inequality, like, say, the division, the separation of powers in a democratic society. So we find that what I would argue is that we need, up to some degree, if we want to have working large-scale societies, we need some institutions that basically help us harmonize our defaults. And then basically bringing these two arguments, yours and mine, together, this would imply that we have to be very careful how to use these stabilizing moments of these collecting institutions. And I would agree, and that's one of the reasons I became an economist, and also one of the reasons why I'm still working with teachers to improve school teaching on how economies work and so, is that the economics part of our education is especially non-conducive to emancipatory thoughts, because this is exactly what happens in the school books. We present the market as a natural solution. We present in the school books free trade as a natural solution. And this is quite more ideologically narrow than, say, presenting Newton's theory
Yeah,
in
that
physics.
immediately a question popped into my head, and I wanted to interrupt before that because you are saying we live in democracy and democratic institutions, but what I'm saying to people around me when I'm talking with them is that we never had democracy, really. Yeah, even in ancient Athens, it wasn't a democracy. We always lived in extreme plutocracies or not so extreme plutocracies. Last time we had really democracy that everyone was involved in decision making more or less on the same level was really in hunter-gatherer societies. And since then, the democratic
Uh,
ethos is
yeah,
kind of suppressed.
some of my
No?
students also say that. For me, that's also,
Sorry, I just wanted to ask the question. We just
huh?
pretend that we live in democracy, same way as we pretend that we live in free trade, because when you grab and go deep, and then you see that there is not much free about it. It's like rules made by the powerful so that the powerless are squeezed. No? And I have so many examples in my head that I can cite that, yeah, if this is free
No,
market,
I would
then
not agree with the latter. So free trade would technically mean less regulation. Of course, there are always rules because otherwise there is no embedding and nothing would work. And then there is, I would say, a alignment between saying free trade, less regulation, and less regulation is typically beneficial to high net worth individuals, so to the very rich global elite, because when there are few regulations, multinational corporations as well as very rich households can do regulatory arbitrage, say profit shifting to save taxes, or maybe shifting environmentally damaging production processes to countries with lower environmental regulation. And this kind of regulatory arbitrage, where you basically can choose a different basis of law for every purpose. This is something that comes very much to the benefit of the global elites, and you also see this in global growth rate. So the average growth of private wealth across the distribution is maybe 0.5% per year, and for the global elite, for the top 1% or top 0.5% globally spoken, it's 7, 8, 9. And this is the big advantage where basically this kind of free trade in the sense of less regulations directly benefits.
I don't know whether you know George Lakoff's political mind and the way how language is
Yeah,
used
sure, yeah.
to kind of manipulate our perception of reality. And this is, in my opinion, it that we call it free trade. It looks, well, who would say no to free? But when it's like a car, you don't understand how car is working, only the auto mechanics does. When you open it and you tinker inside, then you see that, it's it's not free that much. Only one argument that I always say to people is that if it's really so free, why is the information so unfree? I mean, it's hidden. It's on page 766, this small exception, and suddenly everything is upside down. As a
Yeah,
example, I'm giving you.
but
No?
that may work as a polemic, but I don't think it stands up to scrutiny because if you then use free in a vague political way, but typically when it comes to trade or markets, we would associate free with more or less regulation, and more regulation would mean more trade barriers, would mean more capital controls, especially, and this would clearly be detrimental, and this would also clearly be less
Yeah, I don't
free.
know
So
because this is
I
the
think
debate.
this is where
I
does
don't want
one.
to go into this debate. I just wanted to our audience to kind of think about it because what happened to me really recently, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had the ambassador from Senegal here in Vienna. Because I'm in SPO, so we had a discussion with that fella and the stories he told us about what France is doing, not only to Senegal, but the countries in that region today, not 100 years ago or 200 years ago, but today, where if this is free trade, then I will eat crap because that was such a blatant misuse of power as it is. And in my mind, free means equality, and we are on the same, and we have
Yeah,
a
but
discussion as human beings, and we don't
that's
twist
what I
each
say.
other arms. No, because I'm starker and stronger than you are, then you have to follow, otherwise.
yeah,
And Emmanuel Macron comes with it, and he will threaten an army. Yeah,
but that's
that's what he
exactly
was describing. So I was like, okay, man, this is disgusting.
but that's what I say. In your argument, you use the term free more with a connection to dignity and equal standing in a common
No,
exchange.
that's what in my mind connects with free.
Yeah,
Yeah, free equals democratic. Like we are on the same
yeah,
page. We
yeah.
understand each
I
other.
see where you're
We are
going.
free human beings,
But my
six
argument is,
countries, and
yeah, but my
yeah, we play
argument
this
is,
game.
but my argument is that free in the context of free trade is typically understood in a different way. So what we have to do is we have to make this contradiction clear, and this is actually quite analytically important, that more economic freedom can undermine, not in every case, but in many instances it will make it more probably that our political liberty, our dignity, or political freedom, it's sometimes called, is undermined. We use freedom very much as a broad brush term. And often economic freedom and political freedom is the same thing, but only to a certain extent. You know, this is this old insight from Rousseau. You can give people economic freedom, but they should not be so free to become either so rich to buy someone else or so poor to be bought by someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So depending maybe on how we define personal dignity, there are limits to economic freedom imposed by political freedom. And you say, and now I understand what you mean, free trade is not free because it does not bring us really, it doesn't reflect this notion of political freedom and mutual dignity and so. Yeah, that's because free trade is exactly basically overstretching economic freedom, which then fosters inequality on the one hand, and on the other hand is detrimental to political freedom. In my teaching, I have a full lecture devoted to what I call the contradictions of liberalism. You have Keynes was a liberal, or John Stuart Mill, or so. You have political liberals, which are more humanistic and starting from dignity, and you have economic liberals or economic liberalism, which is more really free market and property rights. And there is some overlap between these two because I maybe also it's part of my dignity to own the house I live in or something. We can discuss that if there is an overlap. But when it comes to economic inequality creating power asymmetry, which might feed back on dignity, then you run into problems. And then you cannot say liberalism or free always means the
Yeah.
same. So you have to be careful about where exactly you are going. And I think this is the key
Then
for.
suddenly Peter Thiel tells that the Pope is Antichrist.
I think this is the
As
important
freedom
nuance
goes,
here.
yeah, but maybe that's, that's
And
overstretched.
and
Yeah.
and with democracy, I would still I would make a different point. Um I'm often asked the question whether Jacob, does it? I teach a lecture in economic history also, and I'm often asked, Jacob, does it really make sense to, so to say, separate political rule from economic rule? Isn't at the end of the day, political rule, political power, to be reduced or strongly aligned with economic relationship with distributional asymmetries. So basically, isn't policy just an extension of property rights and elite interests? And I would argue, yes, it has played out this way in the probably majority of events in the course of history since the Neolithic Revolution. But nonetheless, I would argue that the state or the political sphere is a sphere that is contested. And we have these examples like the New Deal, like the strengthening and empowering of unions, like the rise of the welfare state, and maybe also more, say, liberal reforms like the introduction of insolvency law, so which makes it possible to become an entrepreneur even if you're not rich. I mean, you can at least take a credit and try without basically risking your existence. I think the fact that we have developed at some points in time, maybe at lucky occasions or at specific windows of opportunities, that we have collectively developed also tools that are not only helpful for stabilizing, for making us more resilient, but also are really inclusive and empowering. And up to some extent, I would say that although it often goes in the wrong direction, and although maybe the events of the last 40 years give many examples of how it went wrong, especially in Europe, um, because we are more dismantling our stability mechanisms than we are than we but more dismantling them than we are strengthening them. But I still think that we cannot do this simple conflation. We have to admit that in the majority of cases, this image isn't the state just an extension of economic interest. In many cases, this gives you the right prediction, so to say. But there are counter instances, and my recommendation is always to try to learn as much from the counter instances. Look, what are the conditions that lead to them? How have they worked? How can they be made stable and secure?
Let's talk a little bit about the possible solution to our conundrum, what to do about it, because I hope that almost no one wants a war or revolution, that we should be smart and be less kind of aggressive and
Yeah.
and bloody. So the one of the questions from the audience, and well, that's something that I wanted to ask myself as well, is that what about different way of setting up companies? You surely know Mondragon and this whole cooperative movement. Something that most people don't know, maybe you will learn something new from me, is that the second cooperative, so the first one was founded 1844 in Great Britain, and the second one was founded back then, it was Habsburg monarchy, but it was founded in Slovakia. And so we are proud bearers of the, or we used to be proud bearers of the cooperative movement. Between the wars, Czechoslovakia was one of the shining stars in this development. Nowadays, it's not the case, but still, we can claim that, yeah, we were part of the societal movements that made it happen. And supposedly today, some 280 million people work for cooperatives globally. So it's not totally minuscule, unheard of way of doing business and organize economical life of citizens. So what is your take on this? I see it in my mind as a kind of Taoistic thing that the capitalism rules, but in the core of capitalism is this cooperative movement that is kind of hopefully growing, because there's also something that United Nations is claiming, that this movement should be growing and supported. And well, I as a leftist see it as a potential cure for the situation we are living in.
Mm. Yeah, sure. I mean, if you think in terms of basically, this touches on thinking in terms of concrete alternatives. This was also my suggestion. So instead of focusing on basically the many instances where the state really was an extension of economic interest, we should look at the cases where policy created things that maybe empowered us or gave us more freedom in a dignity sense, extended our scope of action and our actual possibilities what to do. And in the very same sense, cooperatives is a sometimes state supported but rather bottom up approach to create concrete alternatives which do not reproduce the basic distributional dynamics based on, so to say, individual property that we discussed before. Within the context of a property based economic system, such organizations are still constrained because they also have they are active on private markets. They compete, so to say, with capitalist firms, and they have these competitive pressures still. And it depends then on their internal flexibility, organizational capability, strength, innovation capabilities, whether they sustain in this competition. So basically, yes, they are a concrete utopia. And sitting here in Germany, it comes to my mind that also the first party manifesto of the German Social Democrats in the 1860s, also 2 centuries ago,
Mm-hmm.
featured the idea of cooperatives as a key way, basically, to transform this
Oh.
economic system. But I think, given this constraint from competition, there would be some incentive also basically to provide institutional incentives or to institutional leeway that, so to say, makes it easier for cooperatives to sustain in the long term.
Now you are pretty good at it in Germany compared with us in Austria and totally with Slovakia or Czech Republic. So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying you are leading the way. The Spanish are ahead of you, I would say. But well,
Yeah,
well,
if you look in Germany, you see it very, very clearly that co-ops typically survived in certain branches, which basically reinforces my argument. So I think given that for example, banking would be a sector where they are still quite strong in Germany, where they basically do not exist in
mm.
manufacturing context. So my argument would be historically indications show that co-ops can really be the spaces for concrete utopias, serve as concrete alternatives, but their long-term sustainability in a capitalist environment will be contested, and hence there I see some
No,
potential
I'm
for
not an
interaction.
expert, but what I hear from people who are experts is that it's not really equal ground that they are competing because supposedly the banks are not exactly eager to give them loans, so they have this
Exactly,
disadvantage.
that was it.
And
There's a
well,
serious.
if we kind of made it really equal as a competition, then maybe the results will be different. But when you have to box with one hand behind your back, then there is no wonder that you get beaten.
Exactly, that's my argument. Basically, if you want to create bottom up, let me put it this way: if you want to create bottom up alternative in this competitive environment, you can always need some help from the top, say some
No, it's
regulatory
not.
advantage.
It's not even help. Just make it equal. Because when you are mistreated, when it doesn't even have to be positive a discrimination. It just you shouldn't be discriminated in the first place
Yeah, but
by the
that's what
banks. Yeah, they
that's
don't
what
want
we
to
would
give you loans
typically.
because they don't like you.
Not,
Yeah.
not that's exactly what I mean, but that's also when we have equal treatment laws. That's the purpose of these laws. No,
Hmm.
it's with equal treatment laws
So
is
what is in
concerned.
your mind the panacea for today's conundrums? You have some priorities, you have some hierarchy what to do. How do you approach it? Because I interject another question from the audience that it's basically even in the interest of the elites to save themselves from the sickles and hammers and
Yeah,
whatnot because they are on the horizon. So you don't wish your children to be kidnapped by someone and then tortured to death because you are a billionaire and yeah, someone wants to get his way to kind of show you.
yeah. I would argue that basically a very unequal society that uses a lot of stabilization mechanisms that are, say, forms of gating, putting people into prison, erecting walls. If in such an environment, probably even the very rich will not be very happy because
Hmm?
their life is a constant source of, or their social
Yeah,
position is also a
24/7
constant source of,
paranoia who comes
yeah, a
through the
little bit.
window. Yeah.
Maybe it depends on
And
your
if it's happened
psychological
today or
resilience.
tomorrow. Well,
I would agree with that. So my personal view would be that we have a lot of challenges. We do not only have the inequality challenge, we also have, say, constant changes in our societies due to increasing digitalization. We also have ecological breakdown, or at least it quite looks like it. So I always like we also maybe have in Europe deindustrialization, where we are unsure whether we want to let this happen or whether we're also probably unsure whether we can stop it. And I like to, when I think in terms of solutions, I like to think in terms of this full spectrum of problems. And this leads me to some conception of win-win strategies. So this is
Well,
also
lay it on
something
us.
that guides my research. So what I did in the past was one obvious tool to alleviate the problem of wealth concentration are wealth taxes. So we ran models calculating the amount of money you can make with a wealth tax, both for Austria and also on a European level. And in this, so to say, to bring this in a framing that also conforms to this idea of a win-win strategy, we compared this with the investment needs for getting Europe carbon neutral. And so, for example, we estimated based on existing studies that you need, say, 600 billion a year investment to really get Europe on a path where it reaches its climate goals. Whereas a wealth tax could, if you do it progressively, which would really have an impact on wealth inequality and maybe lead to a stabilization or reduction of the extreme levels of inequality we had, then you could earn about 350 billion. So more than half of the annual investment requirement in ecological
What
terms.
percentage of wealth tax are you talking about?
This would be a wealth tax that starts at about, so that has a
And it's a pan-European idea, or
it would
every
be a
country would kind of
pan-European.
adjust it for the, because, you know, Luxembourg is somewhere else than, I don't know, Bulgaria.
Exactly. You would simply use the same tax scheme for all countries, which would
Hmm.
automatically lead richer countries to pay more because there are much more Luxembourgians uh, having more than 1 million euro, and 1 million euro in this model would be free. So the first 1 million euro of wealth is not taxed at all. And by doing so, this would mean that you basically tax only about 2% of the European population because 2
Population
3%
or adults? Or
households.
working people, or
Now
how
we're
is it?
talking about households.
Households, okay.
Mm.
So what is it basically? 450 million Europeans, 1% is 4.5
Yeah,
percent.
about
So
10 to
9 million
15.
people roughly,
Yeah,
yeah?
10 to 15, 2 to
Okay.
3%
Okay, okay.
would have more than 1 million net wealth. These would be taxed. And then you would have, say, a tax rate starting with 1%, and then for all wealth greater than 2 million, 2%, and so on.
Okay, and what about the really rich? Like, you know, Arno, what's his name? He's sitting on 200 billion. What will be
And,
his tax?
I mean, there exist, of course, many different models. I've just referenced the number 350 billion. In this model, the tax rate goes up to 10% for all wealth greater than 500 million euros.
Hmm.
So it would be like income tax with tax brackets.
So when you are sitting on 200 billions, like the French fella is, then you would pay 20 billions every year, basically. So in a couple of years, you will be taxed into not a billionaire status, basically. Which
That
is
that
like,
would
yeah, let's do it.
that would
Who
there are
needs
even
200 billions?
there are
Yeah.
even more radical models. So what you will find in Piketty's most recent book on capital and ideology is with the 10%, it would really, for the real billionaires, it would take several decades till they are really down to half a billion, and it also depends on how much they earn. Piketty has a much more radical model where you would basically bring people down to a maximum wealth of 200 million euros within 4 or 5 years, and
Hmm.
this would
So
also,
literally like 90% wealth tax or something of that
yeah,
magnitude.
this would be 90% for all wealth you have that is more than 10,000 times greater than the
Okay.
average,
And
and
now a tricky
60%.
question. When you say this loud, then what? Are you totally crazy, clown? Or people take you seriously, politicians listen, or what is
um
happening in the real
I
world,
mean,
you know?
I would not say that basically. Mhm. I would say that the Piketty suggestion has maybe the advantage that the more moderate progressive taxation models that fly around are not seen as that much illegitimate, because the Piketty model basically exemplifies the idea of a maximum wealth. So that there is some kind of maximum wealth, and if you hold more wealth than that, it's somehow really socially destructive. It has a negative impact. And
I
this,
agree with Thomas. So why not?
no,
Yeah.
no, sure, but then if you have this alternative frame, and I think this is an important conceptual anchor also, then a progressive tax that is somehow comes with high rates does look much more digestible. So now, by bringing in this different perspective, hey, we can not only think about distributions in terms of ex post repairing this with some taxes, but we can also think about this more ex ante. What is a sensible corridor? And this would be maybe the next step, to think about what are sensible corridors for income. What is a sensible minimum wage? What is a sensible max income? We had the idea of max income in the 1970s in
Huh?
the US.
Now, in
That
the
the
40s, no,
marginal,
1942 or 3, FDR was proposing 100% tax from certain incomes. So it was on
you
the
do,
table, yeah, in the
you,
biggest
no,
capitalistic
no, it
economy
was
in the
not only on
history
the
of
table.
mankind.
I mean, it
So
was there. In the 1970s, you had a top marginal tax rate in the US of 90%. 90% is quite close to saying to people, okay, this is the
now
upper
for
limit.
40 years, they were imposing those taxes. And
Exactly.
what is funny about what is not and isn't possible in America, when the Japanese attacked them, literally in a couple of days, they changed huge parts of their economy, and suddenly government was imposing something unheard of just 2 weeks ago.
Sure.
And suddenly you couldn't do whatnot, and from this day you will not be producing cars, you will be producing airplanes, and women will be working, and everything that was impossible just 2 months ago was suddenly possible. So as changes in societies go, we can do a lot if we want to, huh? If we have the reason to do it.
So, yeah, tying this together into a common vision, I would argue that it's actually not too difficult. So, starting from this more pragmatic approach of wealth taxation, where you can also think about how to spend the money in a way that is conducive for other social goals, like with, say, becoming carbon neutral. Another thing you can do is to factor in this kind of extreme wealth inequality when doing policy proposals. So, for example, we did a study on how to get the German residential sector carbon neutral. And we did some calculations on how much would that cost and how many workers do you need. But we also, and we were the first to look at this, did a calculation that asked if we would subsidize the renovations, who would be the net gainer? Who would be the
Hmm.
people who have a net gain from these subsidies? And then you find, oh, surprise, the net gain is with those who have real estate, and hence is with the upper part of the is distribution, and especially with the upper 10%. And we cannot win basically this race against rising inequality and rising ecological degradation if we have policy proposals that remedy one dimension, but at the same time deteriorate, because if we use the general taxpayers' money to do the subsidies, we will subsidize the rich. And here it becomes clear that we
Hmm.
can only reach the ecological goal in an inequality friendly or inequality sensitive way when we impose some requirements on the rich, say to pay for their renovation.
This is what I say for years, that the environment is our biggest friends for the leftists, because, well, we can argue to tax the rich not only from the fairness perspective, but also from the we have to do it because you are the biggest polluters anyway.
Yeah,
So
it's
you
it's
can't
your it's your
continue live like this,
responsibility.
no?
It's your property, no? So
It's just
this
like
for
you will
once.
be saving yourself and your children if you cannot share with the society I don't know, this 90% of your wealth because we need the money anyway to save our asses.
So
So,
what I wanted to say from this pragmatic tax approach, you can even become more pragmatic and look into specific fields and check is it really is the policy proposals we do and is what we think about how to get the ecological turn done, is it really a just transition? Is it really inequality sensitive? But you also,
and
from the text idea, you can move to a higher level of abstraction. And here I would really suggest that this intuition of the corridor that basically also coins Piketty's suggestion on wealth taxes with this upper limit is maybe a conducive way not only to think about what could be a good society or an acceptable society, but also maybe a notion that can be communicated. So you can use this for income. You could say that you would want to have a minimum wage that guarantees social inclusion and at the same time set an upper limit on income that, so to say, avoids socially destructive income inequalities. You can do the same for wealth. You can say everybody should have some a chance or maybe some starting capital to build something in his or her life, whereas at the same time there is an upper limit for wealth because it creates power asymmetries and structural inequalities that go beyond simply, say,
how optimistic
consumption
are
capacity.
you that something like that can be really introduced and the society will be supportive? Did you run some studies? How? Because when you it depends how you ask the question. From what I know, that when you say inheritance tax, then people get all finicky about it and say very often no. But when you frame it as a I don't know, adel tax or how you say nobility taxes or how to put it or anti-feudalism taxes, then suddenly people are not as against it, no? But
Yeah,
anyways, the
I mean,
question is, did you run some studies?
I'm,
What is the support for these ideas, for this radical
also,
taxation of the rich?
for wealth taxes, we have a huge support in the surveys. There's not much need to think. I mean, there are studies on what difference does it makes how you frame it, but I have not looked at them too closely because no matter how you frame it, you
Okay, so it doesn't
typically
matter. Is it because that's what I heard from politicians here in Austria, that when you say inheritance tax, then people very often
the
get
inheritance tax is
uh,
more contested because inheritance tax has been successfully tied by conservatives to the idea of
death tax, yeah, or
a
what?
firm transition of family firms within generations. But for
Uh-huh.
wealth taxes, I think for wealth taxes you have a broad agreement.
Yeah, but even inheritances can be addressed very easily. I mean, government will just become a quiet owner of that company for a couple of years till you pay the taxes off. I mean, it's no rocket science. If you want, there is always a solution. The right is always carrying us with crazy stories that are,
Yeah,
well,
I do not think much about this because what my view is, uh, the inheritance tax is much more contested discursively. There are even more misunderstandings around it when it comes to the wealth tax. At the same
mhm.
time, a wealth tax would have a greater impact. So I really tend to focus
Okay,
on
so
the
purely
wealth
from
tax.
pragmatic perspective, wealth
Yeah,
tax is a better deal. Okay,
because you
got
have to
it.
disentangle so many misunderstandings when it comes to
Uh-huh.
inheritance taxes. And also, there is this personal affection that people might expect to, say, inherit 7,000 euros from their grandma. And this might be the only inheritance in their life. And this is so emotionally loaded
Uh-huh.
that I think the wealth tax is
Okay.
the
No,
clearer
no,
case, the
touche.
case
No,
that
no.
is easier to
Yeah,
make.
I don't know the research data, how supportive are the people
And
to.
probably my experience here is a bit strongly tainted by the German-speaking countries.
Well,
But I think
never mind.
my argument goes on beyond all that. So if my argument on the corridor is you can use it for income, you can use it for wealth, but you can also use it with reference to the donut models to describe the safe space of humanity, where the upper limit are the planetary boundaries and the lower limit are basically socially acceptable material minimum standards of living. And so I would say if we have these old metaphors of expansion and growth and increasing material wealth that coined, so to say, societies in the 19th and 20th century, we need to find new metaphors. And for me, the corridor is something that could integrate distributional considerations, ecological considerations, and also provide a lens to reflect on what is really a good life. Because here I think what we sometimes overlook when we discuss issues like rising inequality, increasing deindustrialization in Europe, the lopsided distribution of the little economic growth we have, or general the fear that we will not have large economic growth rates in the future, uh, is again that I sometimes feel that we miss the fact that within Europe we have already a series of built-in mechanisms, a built-in checks and balances, especially our social spending, but also all the social infrastructure that we have, our mobility infrastructure, even the German trains here that do not run
Yeah,
most
the
of the time.
famous ones. Yeah, yeah,
But at
yeah.
least they exist. Maybe a contested space again, the equitational system, the care facilities for elder care, for childcare. A lot can be improved, but even the facilities we have make life so much better and are not at all appreciated or accounted in public debate. No, if you look at surveys, you will find that living in a large European city is a very good predictor for a high individual satisfaction, a high subjectively experienced quality of life, much higher than in comparable, say, US cities with higher average income. So, given that this quest to have progress and improvement by so to say rising material means has always had a childish element. But in terms of increased scarcity, say in ecological terms, and increased constraints, say in geopolitical terms, currently on the rise,
Mhm.
then we should be maybe then we would do well if we get a clearer picture of what does really drive this benefit of Europe as a place of living that you see everywhere in these multidimensional statistics of what is welfare, what is a good society, how content are people. You always find this premium for Europe. And my view, a key source of this subjective well-being premium that we regularly find are the many social infrastructures we have that make life so much easier and so much more
I live in the best city on the planet, so
Vienna
as
is a
life
key
goes,
example.
then
Vienna
yeah,
is a key
one of the
example.
reasons why I'm here. No?
So
Life is pretty
sometimes
sweet in Vienna.
uh,
Huh?
so this is whatever I say. So, in times of, so to say, increased challenges, exogenous as well as endogenous, we would do well, not as say, an opium or simply to calm ourselves, but to have a realistic impression of our means and capabilities to confront these challenges. We should take into account the large impact our collective infrastructures again have on our well-being. This is something that's often not visible when we tie ideas of well-being directly to material wealth or to say employment numbers or the share of manufacturing. All this is important, but it's the tip of the iceberg that is often visible, whereas below the iceberg there's a lot that makes a life
As
worth
I'm
living.
living in Vienna, we all know Freud and what he came with. What is funny about psychology is that for hundreds of years we were focusing on negative psychology, so all the pathologies, but positive psychology, like what makes us really happy, is relatively new field. So yeah, we don't even know what makes us tick.
And
It's funny, no? That
that's basically the idea, so to say, where I see some
and we
convergence.
have just assumptions, and many of them are totally wrong, and we just, well, this is how it's always done. So yeah, let's continue with this bullshit.
This is basically my message. I mean, maybe 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 one should be more demanding, but still, I would say that the corridor is also quite a good idea for structuring our joint debates and maybe also our individual reflection about what is a good society, what is a good life. It is no accident that the idea of a corridor in the sense of holding balance is repeatedly found in the history of philosophy when the question is raised, what makes a good life? What makes good life choices? No,
Mm,
even going back to Plato and Aristotle, we will find they tell us, be careful. You are a human. You're a complex thing that is not easily understood, and you have many different dimensions in your life that have an impact on your well-being. And this is too complicated. You cannot simply maximize or focus on one, but you have to find the balance between
no? Which is
economic
what we did
interests.
for 2000 years, and now we are returning
Yep.
to our roots and learning that, yeah,
Yeah, probably.
virtuous life is maybe, like it's crazy in European psychology and philosophy. For more or less 2000 years, we lost it from our view how to live a happy life. It wasn't really a philosophical question that much. Anyways, so it was very, very pleasant discussion, yeah, Jacob, but I don't want to impose too much time and take too much time from your day. So thank you very much. And let's continue maybe in a couple of months, because this was interesting, and I'm curious what is on the horizon for Europe, and what's gonna happen, and how can we kind of address the topics that will come upon us. Hopefully, it won't be military with 5% investment into hell war with the hell Russians. So we will see what happens in 2026. Best of
Yeah,
luck to you.
sure.
Best of luck to you. Thank
Many
you.
thanks for the conversation. Have a great day, Michael.
Yeah. Okay.